Hello, I'm standing on Alcatraz Island, and in 1948, at the age of 21, I became the youngest correctional officer guard to work on Alcatraz Island. My name is Frank Heaney. I lived in a city across the bay in Berkeley, and I'd sail on a ferry boat between Oakland and San Francisco, and when we passed this island, my folks told me about all these characters on it. Never thought at a later date I'd meet them. I was in the downtown post office in Berkeley, and I seen a notice on the board asking for correctional officers. Took it, passed it, I was called to the warden's office. When I walked in there, I just turned 21. And the warden looked at me and said, "Young man, you're absolutely too young and immature for this job. We need older seasoned men. It'd be too difficult for you." But I prevailed on him, and I took all the civil service tests. I took the written, the oral, the agility. I qualified. I should be given an opportunity. Now, we talked that way for almost an hour. And then, unfortunately, he agreed with me, and I went to work. Now, why do I say unfortunately? Because Alcatraz was designed and run as a maximum security, minimum privilege penitentiary. That meant our inmates had very minor amount of privileges. No tailor-made cigarettes, candy bars, chewing gum, soft drinks, radios, television, newspapers, paroles, or rehabilitation programs. They had none of that by being sent here. In fact, none of our inmates came from a court. They're all sent from another prison or having a problem. And someone told me from the prison they came from, the warden of that institution would have a picture of Alcatraz behind his desk, and he'd point to a picture and say, "If I see you one more time, that's where you're going. You are going to Alcatraz." And you knew you're going to do some tough times. Now, we get many visitors here from all over the world, some from Sweden also. And they would look out and say, "Well, gee, look at these beautiful views they have. You know, they got San Francisco, they got the East Bay, they got Marin County." Yes, how would you like to have water held out to you and you can't drink it? It's a city so close and yet so far. Now, the island started off first as a military fortress back in the 1850s up until around 1900. At that time, the Army decided that it was no longer needed as a fort. It was torn down by Army inmates who were here at the same time. And after they tore down the old fort, they built the building you'll see on top of the hill, a Army prison in 1909. And after the Army prisoners built it, they're allowed to move in. And then the Army remained on Alcatraz until around 1933 because of military downsizing, a lot of it because of the Great Depression of the 30s. It closed, but for a very short time, because there was a man back in Washington, D.C. whose name was J. Edgar Hoover. He was a former director of the FBI, and he thought this would be a great place to house the type of inmates and criminals of that era. And so our first group of 53 inmates were sent from the federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia. They came across country in a railroad car, and when they came to the Bay Area, instead of taking inmates from the train to be put onto a boat, which would be a lot less expensive, they put the whole train in a barge. This dock area was just loaded with railroad cars. And one of the reasons for the high security was because of one man. His name was Al Capone, one of our first inmates here in the island. Now, Big Al stayed here for about 5 years. He left for two reasons. First of all, his sentence was almost served. He was only doing time for income tax evasion. We know he did more, but that's all they could get on him. Secondly, most importantly, is he had syphilis, so his mind was starting to deteriorate. They sent him to his home in Miami Beach in Florida. He was 48 years old when he died. And then a week later, another group of 100 inmates came from Leavenworth, Kansas. And one of them was George Machine Gun Kelly, who, if you take the audio tour today on Alcatraz, you'll hear me talking about him. He reminded me more of a bank president than a bank robber. The way he acted, the way he talked, even the way he dressed. You see, he was our clerk in our laundry. We had the largest military laundry in the West Coast, and he was always well pressed. And I asked him when I was assigned in that area how he got started in crime. Well, when he was a young boy, he was a runner for a bootlegger. That's the kid that brings the booze between the bootlegger and the customer. Later on, got to be the bootlegger himself. Made big money for those times, but that ended in the Great Depression of the early 30s when the Volstead Act was thrown out by the Roosevelt administration. So he was out of a job, like a lot of people were at that time, and that's how he got into bank robbery and how he got his name, Machine Gun Kelly. Because when he went into a bank to hold it up, he said he took a Tommy gun out of a case and said, "Stick them up," to the employees of the bank, and that's how he. That's that's what got his name, Machine Gun Kelly, because from that time on, the media picked up on that, and kids would go up and down the street saying, "Extra, extra, read all about it. Machine Gun Kelly strikes again." So forevermore we'll know about Machine Gun Kelly. But what's more interesting than anything was his arrest. He was arrested by a man named Purvis. Now, Purvis was a well-known FBI agent back in the early 30s, and Purvis come crashing through his hotel door with a Tommy gun in his hand, and when George Kelly seen him, he put his hands up and says, "Don't shoot G-Man, government man," and that's when that term G-Man came into effect. But he was worried because of a couple of things. He heard about Pretty Boy Floyd and Babyface Nelson both getting killed by the FBI outside of Chicago, and then another man inside Chicago named John Dillinger. John Dillinger was coming out of a theater with the lady in red as a decoy, and they gunned him down by the FBI. So Kelly didn't want to be the next one, and he remained here for many years, and then died at Leavenworth, a federal prison in Kansas. But the one that was the biggest character, and the one that most of us disliked, was a man named Robert Stroud. Robert Stroud is also known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. No birds in Alcatraz. At Leavenworth, that's where he had his birds. In the year 1909, he killed a man on the territory of Alaska, and they sent him to McNeil Island, a federal prison in the state of Washington. While there, he stabbed an inmate 6 times and gave him more time and sent him off to Leavenworth. He was to have a visit from his mother, but it was canceled because of a minor infraction, and so he planned to murder the officer who wrote him up. And while he walked by in the dining hall, he rose up from the table, stabbing the man in the heart, killing him. And so they sentenced him to hang. While they're building the gallows, his mother got to President Wilson, had the sentence changed to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. And so they went by the original sentence, which stated, "You are to remain in isolation until execution." And so Robert Stroud remained 44 years in isolation. Yes, 44 years. 54 years total in prison. As far as we know, it is the longest sentence of any man alive in recorded history in complete isolation. In 1942, while back at Leavenworth, he had a couple of cells full of birds. Other inmates wanted birds and cats and dogs and bunnies, and it was getting to be a real problem, so they said, "Let's send Stroud to Alcatraz." And he came here in 1942, was placed in D Block, Special Treatment Unit. That's where we kept our worst inmates. Stayed there until 1948, about the time I started work on the island. Now, he was developing what is known as Bright's disease, a kidney condition, needed further medical treatment, put him in isolation in the prison hospital. That's when I got to know him better, because I had to search his cell as we searched all inmate cells on the island looking for contraband. He's probably one of the most interesting characters I've ever met in my life, and perhaps one of the most intelligent. He was a genius. The man with a third-grade education could read and write in about 3 or 4 languages. He was a very prolific writer. He wrote Robert Stroud's Digest of Bird Diseases, which he had published, and still is in the public libraries today. But he was psychotic. He was prone to murder. But perhaps if you spend 44 years in isolation, you might be a little testy too. Well, he stayed, in 1959, his medical condition was getting worse. They sent him off to Springfield, Missouri, a prison hospital. When on November 21st of 1963, he died, and that's why no one knew when he died, because the following day, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Now, Stroud probably would have been front page, somewhere in the front page, because a movie with Burt Lancaster just came out. But because of the death of Kennedy, there was no other news. But you know, there's one thing about this item. A #1 question is escapes. We had a total of 36 inmates and 14 tries to escape from Alcatraz, and most of them were brought back. Some were shot and killed, and some drowned. But there are 5 inmates still missing. There are 5 still missing, and they made a movie a few years ago, a number of years back, called Escape from Alcatraz with Clint Eastwood. It was a real good movie, a Hollywood movie, and it did tell about these 3 men that escaped, and the part played by Clint Eastwood in that movie Escape from Alcatraz was Frank Lee Morris, and the others are the Angler brothers, Clarence and John. What an ingenious escape attempt that was. Now, they knew they couldn't get out the front of the cell. The front is made out of K-SAR and steel bars, and you'll see all that when you take your visit to Alcatraz. But in the back, there is a small vent hole. And they figured if they could get through that vent hole, it leads into a plumbing corridor, which leads to the roof, which goes to a vent down the side of the building. Now, if you've seen the movie Escape from Alcatraz, you witness Clint Eastwood going through 8 inches of concrete with a fingernail file and a spoon. Now, if you want to believe that, I'll sell you the Golden Gate Bridge. But, you know, Hollywood, they kind of make up a few things, and it probably looks better to do it with a fingernail file and a spoon. That wasn't going to work. So what those fellas did, they found an old vacuum cleaner, and they stripped it apart and improvised it into a drill. And they drilled small pilot holes around that existing vent hole, and with tools they stole from the industry's shipping tools, they made those small holes into one big one. Now, they had to disguise that hole. You can't have a hole like that showing. We'd see it right away. So they were allowed to paint. They made an actual painting, a rendition of that vent hole. Even had it indented so it looked third dimensional, so anytime an officer walked by and looked in, he thought he was seeing the real vent hole. They also had to do something with that debris. You can't put concrete into a toilet or basin, it would clog it up. So they did show movies here from time to time, and they showed a movie then that was unbelievable. The censor must have been asleep, and it was called Stalag 17, which is about a prisoner of war camp during World War II in Germany, where these Allied prisoners were trying to get out, William Holden being the lead actor. And so what they did is they cut a hole on the bottom of their barracks, and they started tunneling out to the fence line. Now, they had to do something with their debris, so on the way to work, they put it in their pockets and dropped it out in the yard. These inmates did the same thing. So they left after 9:30, 9:30 being lights out. So they had to show the officer that walked by at nighttime that they were still inside their bunk. So they got magazines, they cut them up, soaked them in water, and formed them into paper mache. They were allowed to paint, so they used flesh tone paints on those faces, and they needed hair. So one inmate was a barber. They got hair on the barber shop for the top of the head, so that during the night, as the officer walked by where they were gone, he thought he was seeing the real head. So sometime after 9:30, they put the heads on the bunk, and then they took the painting away in the back, and then put it back in again, and then they walked up that plumbing and went to the north end of the building. Now, one thing we didn't have on Alcatraz was a swim team. So they had no way to get prepared for this arduous trip. You know, it's about 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles, depending on which way you go, whether it's to the south or to the north. And this water is 55 degrees. You know, so they didn't get really prepared to do that. So they knew they had to get something to help them out. So they got raincoats, they cut them up, and vulcanized them together with the steam heat pipes we had here. They needed a way to blow them up, and they're allowed to have instruments. So they got an accordion. They blew up they got the bellows out of the accordion to blow up the rubber life raft. So here they are down at the beach, and we think they're headed towards Angel Island. Angel Island is a large island about 1.25 miles from here, and they thought if they get on that island, they can steal a boat and go up north, because they knew that as soon as they were found out, there would be a large manhunt. Sure enough, there was the largest manhunt there ever was in the Bay Area. They called out the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard. They had every law enforcement officer they could find looking for those men. And in fact, you know, major crime stopped for about a week because of all the major involvement of all that law enforcement, but they didn't find them. Now, we think they got swept out in the ocean because there's one thing they did not know was the tides. There was about an 8-knot tide going out towards the Golden Gate, so we think they get swept out in the ocean. And to prove that point, I worked over 10 years ago with Robert Stack on a program called Unsolved Mysteries. And what NBC did is they hired 3 professional rafters with professional equipment, and they what they did is make up these. They had these rubber rafts. And they had one other thing the inmates didn't have at the time was wetsuits. So they had the wetsuits on, and we watched them as they took off. And But they got out maybe about 10 to 20 feet, not too bad. But once the tide hooked on that was going out towards the Golden Gate, they get swept out towards the ocean, and they got picked up. So that's why we think they probably got swept out in the ocean. Now, another program I worked on about 4 years ago was America's Most Wanted. What the Fox network did is they offered $1 million reward for the arrest and capture of those 3 inmates. And to show the public how they look today, they computer enhanced the pictures. They aged them from their mid-30s to their mid-70s and showed them out over that Fox network for a year's time. I called up John Walsh a month after the program aired, and I said, John, what kind of response are you having to that reward? He told me that their phones are literally coming off the hook. They are calling from all over the country. They are saying that their brother-in-law looks like one of those guys. Their neighbor looks like one of them. I'm sure they're turning their mother for $1 million, you know. And they had reports as far as South America. So they might have linked up with Elvis and Hoff. The rest of them went down there. We don't know. But we really feel that they did drown. If they probably would have made it, if they did, they probably would have been caught by now because they're constantly in and out of jail all the time. So that's one of the mysteries. There are 2 other fellows, they escaped in 1937. Their names were Coe and Rowe, and they haven't been seen since also. But they'd be well over 100 years old. So if they didn't drown in the water, they must have died of old age. So those are some of the things that you'll see here on Alcatraz Island. It's a great tour given by the National Park Service. It's open every day of the year except Christmas and New Year's Day. So when you come to Northern California,